He was just a boy, no older than 14, taken from obscurity and thrown into the heart of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen, not to be honored, but to be transformed. His name was Sporus, though history almost erased him. After Nero's wife, Poppaea Sabina, died, some say by his own hand, the emperor descended into grief, madness, and obsession. What followed wasn't mourning, it was reenactment. Nero ordered a search across the empire for a boy who resembled her, and when they found one, he was forced to become her. Not symbolically, not metaphorically. He was stripped of his name, his identity, and reshaped into a mirror of a dead empress, dressed, spoken to, paraded through Rome. This wife, this, is not fiction? This happened. And the worst part? No one stopped him. Subscribe. If you believe some truths, no matter how disturbing, must be told. Because this one has been buried under centuries of silence, and history deserves witnesses. In the year 65 AD, the Roman Empire was not simply ruled, it was owned by one man. Nero, Claudius Caesar, a figure draped in both imperial robes and madness, stood atop the world. He had conquered rebellions, silenced senators, and turned the Colosseum into a theater for his fantasies. But in private, his empire was rotting. From within, and the crack that split him open was the death of his wife. Poppaea Sabina, once the Empress of Rome, had been beautiful, sharp-witted, and dangerously adored by Nero. Her death was sudden. Some said illness. Others whispered the emperor had struck her during a rage, but Nero refused to believe she was gone. He didn't weep like a widower. He screamed. He refused burial, kept her embalmed body close for days. Then, one evening, as Rome watched its mad ruler burn with grief, he declared something chilling. She will return. Behind the marble walls of the imperial palace, a secret order was issued. Find someone, anyone, who looked like Poppaea. The emperor's servants fanned out across Rome, across provinces, across households of senators and generals. Artists and sculptors were shown busts of the late empress and asked, in hushed tones, if they had seen a face like hers. Eunuch, who made the discovery. In a coastal estate nearby, a boy had been sold into domestic service months earlier. His name was Sporus. No last name, no lineage, just a boy. He was slender, with soft eyes, and an unnatural grace to his movements. His cheekbones, one official noted, were hauntingly familiar. When they held up a coin bearing Poppaea's likeness, the resemblance was undeniable. And that was all it took. He was taken without trial, without protest. The family who owned him didn't dare question it. When the emperor wants a slave, he gets one. Sporus never saw the sea again. He arrived in Rome under cover of night, brought through the back entrance of the Domus Aurea, Nero's golden palace. Lavish halls once filled with musicians, now echoed. With silence, the emperor no longer laughed. He whispered, muttered, drank deeply and stared at empty thrones. When Nero first saw Sporus, he stood still. He circled the boy. He asked him to turn, to speak. And when the boy, confused and terrified, muttered his name, Nero said only, "No, you are Poppaea now." Sporus was stripped of his tunic and washed in milk and oils. His hair was styled to match the late empress. His eyebrows were plucked, his hands manicured. He was clothed in silk stole, the long garments reserved for noblewomen, and adorned with pearls and gold bracelets. They called it a transformation, but it was something else. The boy was unmade. Every day, he was trained by court attendants to walk like a noblewoman, to speak with poise, to eat with elegance. His voice, already soft, was deliberately trained into submission. No orders, no resistance. The whispers began to spread across Rome. The emperor has taken a boy to replace the empress. But no one intervened, because Nero was still Caesar. And if Caesar believed the dead could be reborn through the body of a child, then so be it. One evening, as Sporus stood silently in the emperor's chamber, dressed in Poppaea's favorite gown, Nero approached with a golden ring. He slid it onto the boy's finger. "We are married now," Nero whispered. Sporus did not cry. He only nodded. Because in Rome, even obedience could not save you. The wedding was not official, at least, not in the eyes of Roman law, but in the twisted mind of Emperor Nero, the ceremony had been divine. He declared it publicly. Papa Yah had returned, and the empire would rejoice in her resurrection. It wasn't Papa Yah who now walked the palace halls. It was Sporus, a boy of 14, draped in golden fabrics. Wearing the veil of a dead empress, and carrying the unbearable weight of another person's memory, Rome buzzed with rumors. Senators whispered behind columns. The Vestal virgins murmured in their temples. The people in the streets laughed nervously, but no one dared speak against it aloud. Those who had challenged Nero before had vanished, and besides, hadn't the boy agreed to it? That's what they told themselves to sleep better. Inside the palace, life for Sporus followed rituals of the imperial court, with one crucial difference. He was not treated as a servant, he was treated as a wife. He dined beside Nero, sat silently during imperial decrees, wore the rings and perfumes once belonging to Papa Yah, attended festivals on Nero's arm, hidden behind a sheer veil as crowds tried to glimpse the miracle of the Empress reborn. But behind the velvet curtains, there was no miracle. Only silence. Sporus rarely spoke, unless spoken to. When he did, it was in carefully measured tones, never too loud, never too soft. He smiled when expected. He cried in secret, behind embroidered screens, with only his reflection to witness it. He had not chosen this role. It simply survived long enough to play it. One evening, during a private banquet held in the Domus Transitoria, Nero summoned poets and actors to perform a tragedy he had written himself, a reenactment of Papa Yah's death. He cast himself in the role of the grieving husband, and Sporus in the role of Papa Yah. The scene was grotesque theater. The emperor wailed, clutched the boy's hands, and threw himself to the floor in sobbing fits as Sporus stood motionless, lips trembling, trying not to collapse. When the scene ended, Nero rose and kissed him before all in attendance. The senators applauded, musicians played, the boy's face burned with shame. Later that night, alone in the emperor's chamber, Sporus looked at his reflection in the bronze mirror, the painted lips, the kohl-lined eyes, the jeweled collar. He no longer recognized the boy beneath it all. Sporus began to understand that he was not simply a symbol of grief. He had become Nero's obsession, living monument to a fantasy that refused to die. And fantasy in Rome could be dangerous. He was not allowed outside the palace without escorts. His meals were selected for him. Even the tone of his voice was corrected by chamberlains who had once served the real Papa Yah. They whispered comparisons constantly. She used to smile more. She preferred blue silk, not crimson. He was not just filling a role, he was being rewritten. But not all the empire remained blind. In corners of the Senate, whispers of revolt began to rise again. Nero's excesses, his cruelty, his madness, and now, this charade had shaken even the most loyal. Someone would act, eventually, but for Sporus, there was no escape. Yet, one night, as he walked through the imperial gardens beneath the moonlight, he found a note tucked beneath a potted olive tree. In rushed handwriting, it read, "He will fall."
Oh, when he does run.
Sporus looked around, but saw no one, only the wind, only Rome, holding its breath. Spring turned to summer, and with each passing month, the empire's golden veneer cracked. Nero, once hailed as divine, had grown erratic, even by his own standards. His days were spent composing songs no one dared critique, his nights lost in orgiastic performances that blurred pleasure, grief, and madness. Through it all, Sporus remained at his side, silent, dressed in silks, painted and praised as a living ghost. But the senators no longer bowed as low, the legions no longer sang his name. Deep inside Nero's own court, loyalty had begun to rot. It started subtly, a delay in messages from distant provinces, quiet nods between officers when Nero turned his back. Governors in Gaul and Hispania stopped responding to orders, claiming confusion in chain of command. Nero ignored it at first, convinced his divine charisma would bring them back. Sporus saw the unraveling more intimately. Nero's affection had become volatile. One evening, he clutched the boy's face and wept, repeating Papier's name over and over. Next night, he ignored Sporus entirely, instead locking himself in a chamber with 2 foreign dancers and a pet leopard. For Sporus, it was both relief and terror. Each day Nero forgot him was a reprieve and a warning, because Nero didn't let go of things. He consumed them. Whispers grew into movements. Gaius Julius Vindex, a governor in Gaul, declared open rebellion. Legions under Servius Galba began marching toward Rome. The Senate, once spineless, now convened in secret. Inside the palace, Nero raged. He screamed at statues, burned documents, threatened to drown Rome in blood if they dared rise against him. And still, no one stopped him. Not the guards. Not the attendants. Not even the boy in the veil who watched from the shadows. Sporus had not forgotten the note. When he falls, run. He began preparing quietly. He spoke to no one, but he listened to everything. He mapped servant tunnels in his mind, counted guard rotations, hid a cloak beneath the garden steps. It wasn't hope, it was survival. Then came the night it all changed. Sporus was awakened just before dawn by the trembling hands of an old eunuch who had once powdered his face. The Senate has declared him an enemy of Rome, the man whispered. Galba marches. The Praetorians have turned. The Emperor, he's fled. Sporus sat up. Fled where? South, to the villa of Finn. He took only a handful with him and me. The man looked away. He didn't ask for you. For a brief, horrible moment, Sporus felt a stab of something like grief or confusion. Had it all meant nothing? The ceremonies, the marriage, the endless nights under, painted ceilings? But then he realized no, it had never been about him. It had always been about her. He was not a boy. He was a memory. And now, not even that. As the palace collapsed into panic, slaves fleeing, guards tearing down emblems, nobles burning, Letter Sporus stood in the center of the ruined garden, where he had once been crowned a bride. He walked slowly toward the gates. No one stopped him. No one even looked. Rome had turned its eyes to the next emperor. The child Nero tried to mold into Papa. No longer mattered. But he still carried the ring. Golden ring Nero had placed on his finger the day he said, "We are married now." Sporus slipped it off and let it fall into the fountain. The emperor was dead. Nero, once worshipped as a god, had fled through the night like a hunted animal and cornered. In a suburban villa outside Rome, taken his own life with the help of a slave. He died not in glory, not in ceremony, but in shame, murmuring, "What an artist dies in me." And yet even in death, he cast a long shadow. Sporus, the boy who had been dressed like a dead empress, was free, but not safe. The collapse of Nero's reign had left behind no peace, only power struggles. The Senate scrambled to restore order. The Praetorian Guard changed allegiance by the day, and those who had been closest to the emperor, even unwillingly, were now political liabilities. Sporus became one of them. In the early days after Nero's suicide, Sporus wandered the city wearing a plain tunic for the first time in years. No veil, no perfume, no silk. But anonymity did not protect him. His face had been seen by too many. The boy bride of Nero had become a morbid fascination in the streets. Children whispered when he passed. Men laughed behind closed doors. Women stared at him with something between pity and revulsion. Even the name Sporus became a cruel nickname among the elite, a byword for disgrace. He was no longer a person. He was a rumor. Then came Nymphidius Sabinus, the Praetorian prefect who had helped betray Nero and now sought the throne for himself. He sent for Sporus not to arrest him, but to possess him. He was Nero's bride, Sabinus told his advisors. Let the people see that the gods now favor me. Sporus was given new robes, new chambers, a new identity once. Again, against his will. The same cruel theater resumed, with a new emperor trying to use the same mask. But it didn't last. Sabinus was murdered before he could seize full power. And Sporus, barely 15, was once again alone. Next came Otho, then Vitellius, then Vespasian. Rome chewed through rulers like meat on a banquet table.
During
This chaos, Titus, Vespasian's son and future emperor, quietly offered Sporus a place in his household, not as an ornament but as a person. Some say he admired the boy's resilience. Others believe it was strategy to remove a dangerous symbol from public view. For the first time, Sporus slept without guards outside his door. For the first time, he was asked his opinion. And for the first time, he was allowed to say no. But the trauma ran deep. He didn't speak much. He kept to himself. He still sometimes traced the spot on his finger where Nero's ring had once rested, a habit he could not break. Years passed. The empire moved on. The statues of Nero were melted. His name was erased from monuments. Scrolls were redacted. Rome pretended he had never existed, but Sporus still existed. He lived quietly in the hills outside Rome, never taking another name, never returning to the palaces that had stolen his childhood. He tended to a small garden, kept a journal, lit a candle each year on the day Nero died, not to mourn him, but to remind himself that he had survived him. He told his story to no one, not fully, but it lived in his silence. In the way he refused to wear gold. In the way he never looked in polished mirrors. In the way he flinched just slightly when someone called him beautiful. Until one morning, messengers from the capital arrived at his door. They brought a summons from the emperor himself. "You are requested for a ceremony," the letter read. Sporus read it once, twice, then burned it, because he had learned. One thing Rome never did: some performances are not worth repeating. Years had passed since Sporus had last heard his name spoken in the marble halls of Rome, and when the imperial courier had appeared, carrying the official scroll sealed in red wax, something inside him stirred. Not fear, not exactly, but a cold recognition. A ghost had knocked. He hadn't expected to see Rome again. The city he had once ruled beside a madman, not as himself, but as a shadow of a woman long dead. A costume, a memory, a body repurposed by power, and yet he went not for ceremony, not for obligation. He went because part of him needed to look the city in the face and see if it still held the boy prisoner. The new emperor, Vespasian, was not like Nero. He was a general, a builder, a stabilizer. The empire was recovering, so people needed law, not lust. Still, power in Rome was never free of politics, and those around Vespasian had not forgotten Sporus. He was summoned not to be mocked, but to be displayed again. This time, to show the strength of the new reign. Look how even Nero's demons kneel now. Sporus didn't kneel. He arrived not in silk, but in a plain wool cloak. He refused attendance, refused paint, refused to wear shoes carved with emperors' names. The same boy who had once been forced to parade through Rome in a bridal veil now walked across the forum like a farmer's son, and when he was presented before the Senate, the silence was different this time, not out of awe, out of shame. The ceremony was brief: a pardon, a symbolic gesture of peace. They gave him gifts he didn't want: a golden cup, a signet ring, a laurel wreath he didn't touch. Vespasian, seated above them all, nodded once and said, "You are no longer bound to his memory." But he was wrong. You don't unbind from trauma. You carry it in your voice, in your bones, in the way you breathe when the wind smells like the oils they used to bathe you. That night, Sporus walked alone through the ruins of Nero's palace. The Domus Aurea was broken, looted, half buried beneath new construction, but parts of it remained. Cracked marble, faded mosaics, a fragment of the ceiling where he had once stood beside the emperor, called bride while the empire cheered. Sat in the center of what had once been the octagonal hall, now open to the stars, and closed his eyes. For the first time, he allowed himself to remember, not as the world had remembered, but as it truly was. He remembered the moment the ring slid onto his finger, the moment the veil was tied behind his head, the silence after the kiss in front of the senators. He remembered the humiliation, the violation, the hollowness. But he also remembered surviving it, and that was something Nero never did. He left Rome the next morning and never returned. He settled in a small coastal village near Regum, far from politics and palaces. He lived alone. Some say he grew herbs and sold them at the market. Others say he helped write histories under a pseudonym, correcting the records that tried to bury him. No one really knows. What is known is this: he refused to let anyone call him Papa Ya again. He refused gold. He refused to speak the emperor's name, and he never again wore a ring. Years later, a historian named Suetonius would write of Nero's marriage to a boy and dismiss it as another act of perversion. The record would mock Sporus, distort him, forget that he had a name before the crown was placed on his head. But behind those dusty scrolls was a boy who had lived, suffered, and somehow walked away. Not a myth, not a joke, a survivor, on his final day. The village priest found him sitting beneath a fig tree, his eyes closed, lips slightly parted. In his lap was a faded piece of silk, and in his hand, a tiny bronze ring, not the one Nero had given him, but a plain circle, marked by empire. There was no inscription on his grave, just a stone and a single word colon SPOR, US, because that was enough. That was who he had been before the mask, before the ceremony, before the crown, the boy who wore her name and lived to bury it.